Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cutting through the conventional narratives of war to get to what we call the hidden front. This is the battlefield where the real fight isn't with bullets or tanks, it's in the mind.
Yeah, it's about beliefs, deep-seated fears.
Exactly. And the lies governments spin to survive. Our mission today is to do a deep dive into one specific, pivotal incident. Saipan, August 1944.
Listen, if you want to understand the psychological pressure cooker of the Pacific, Saipan is your benchmark. The American invasion had, just ripped the island apart.
Right.
But the real story, the one we've pulled from these sources, it's about 15 Japanese civilian women. They survived the carnage, they surrendered, and in doing that, they walked straight into the teeth of the most terrifying propaganda campaign you can imagine.
Death before dishonor. That was the command.
It was simple. And the lie they fed everyone was that Americans weren't soldiers. They were monsters. Animals who would torture, rape, and butcher them. It's all right there in the records.
Exactly. The stakes were absolute. So this wasn't just armies clashing. It was a clash of truth and terror. And we have sources detailing the experience of these 15 women and how, within just days of their capture, a series of simple, unexpected acts of competence and compassion just demolished a decade of that ideological conditioning.
Yeah, we're tracking the exact moment their entire belief system, the foundation of their culture's resistance, shattered completely.
A psychological victory won not by air power.
No, it was won by a Red Cross armband and a simple injection of morphine.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. Before we get to that seismic moment of collapse, we need to fully understand the world these women were in, psychologically, physically. What was the environment like right after the battle for Saipan before they even encountered the medics?
It was operational chaos, just layered over pure human exhaustion. The environment itself was designed to inflict trauma.
So let's set the scene. Paint the picture for us using the details from the sources. August 1944. This group of 15 women, including Ko, the 23-year-old nurse, what did they actually see and smell and feel walking down that road?
It was a landscape of recent annihilation.
Right.
I mean, imagine the worst summer heat you've ever felt.
Right.
Then mix in the stench of a giant improvised incinerator.
Awful.
The road wasn't paved. It was packed dirt, deeply scarred, dusty, and just cracked wide open under this brutal Pacific sun. The battle was technically over, but the island was still smoking. The air was thick, almost chewable.
And the air itself, it carried the proof of the trauma.
There's the smell of death. Not just, you could see, but the chemical residue of war.
Right.
It smelled like burnt metal, like cordite high explosives. And then there was this deep, persistent odor of decomposing bodies. A sweet, sickening smell that the wind carried everywhere. No amount of rain could wash that away.
And they had to walk through that for 3 days.
3 days straight. Lungs coated with dust and smoke. The sun just beating down on them, reminding them they were still alive, but barely.
In their condition, I mean, it speaks volumes about the hell they'd just survived. Torn civilian clothes, brown with dirt and blood, walking slowly, painfully.
Many were barefoot. Their sandals had just disintegrated. They weren't soldiers, but they were carrying the physical and psychological scars of combat just as surely.
Absolutely.
And the walking itself was torture. 3 days into this surrender journey, no real food, hardly any water. The breathing was short, labored. They're moving past the junk of the invasion. Burned out tanks, bomb craters big enough to swallow a car, palm trees that looked like broken skeletons, their tops that just sheared off by artillery. And every sound was a threat. The rumble of American bulldozers, the harsh foreign English of the guards, and worst of all, the occasional crack of unseen gunfires. Patrols were still clearing out caves. It was an environment that just kept reinforcing the terror.
That terror wasn't accidental, was it? It was carefully cultivated. We have to talk about the depth of the propaganda because it dictates everything that happens next.
You can't overstate this. This was not just wartime rhetoric. This was a sophisticated, state-level psychological application tied directly to cultural ideas like Bushido, the way of the warrior, which, had saturated civilian life.
So surrender was the ultimate shame.
The ultimate shame.
Yeah.
The military doctrine made sure every civilian was told explicitly that the Americans would do unspeakable things. Torture, brutal rape, slow execution, and feeding the remains to dogs.
And crucially, this worked. It wasn't just an idle threat. It motivated thousands of people to kill themselves.
It resulted in mass suicide. I mean, you've heard of suicide cliff and banzai cliff. People jumping, throwing their children first, then themselves. Using grenades handed out by soldiers.
Unbelievable.
The conditioning was so absolute, so complete, that death was universally seen as the preferable, honorable path. So for these 15 women to choose surrender, to choose life, they had already committed an unpardonable cultural sin in their own minds.
And here's the brutal, tragic irony that the sources reveal. The physical trauma they were carrying at that moment wasn't even inflicted by the enemy they feared.
That's the core of it. That's the psychological baggage these women brought with them.
Yeah.
Our sources confirm they were covered in bruises, not from American soldiers, but from their own Japanese officers.
Why?
They were beaten mercilessly for the crime of surrendering, for choosing to live instead of dying for the emperor.
Wow.
So they'd been physically and spiritually punished by their own side. So as they walked toward their American captors, he fully expected the abuse they had just suffered to transition seamlessly into the promised monstrous torture. Their survival decision had already failed them once. They believed the worst was still coming.
And within this unbearable environment of guilt, pain, and absolute terror, Koku, the young nurse, she starts to feel the collapse begin.
The human body can only take so much, especially under that kind of psychological distress. She felt this deep shooting pain start in her lower back. It just radiated down into her hips with every single step.
And she was trying to hide it.
Biting her lip, trying to suppress the sound, thinking, I cannot show weakness to the enemy. That cultural programming, the refusal to show pain, it was still active, even as her body was just completely failing her.
But the pain intensified so quickly, it became paralyzing. The moment of collapse was sudden and total.
Her legs they just failed her. The description in the sources is visceral. She falls forward onto the dirt road, screaming. Not just from the pain, but from the sudden terrifying realization that she couldn't move her legs. It felt like they had been severed from her body.
And the fear must have amplified it.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer agony was amplified by the fear that this was it. She had slowed the column down, and now the monsters would finish her. Her friend Yuki drops down next to her, pleading, "Can you stand?" The answer was no. The surrender that had already earned her a beating had now left her completely vulnerable, paralyzed on the ground, waiting for the execution.
And this is the moment of truth. They had been programmed to expect immediate cruelty, to be shot or stabbed or just left to die. But now, in the face of this profound physical helplessness right in front of the supposed monsters, what was the immediate documented reaction of those American soldiers escorting them?
It was not what they expected. Not violence, it was confusion.
That's the first point in the narrative. The American soldiers, who are likely exhausted, hardened infantrymen, they stopped. What did they do?
They stopped, certainly. But they didn't draw weapons or start shouting. And our sources note they looked intensely uncomfortable and confused.
Right. This is off script for them.
Totally outside the normal parameters of moving prisoners. You expect resistance, you expect compliance, but you don't expect a sudden catastrophic medical emergency in the middle of a dirt road.
So what did they do?
One tall soldier, identified by his red hair and a bad sunburn, he called out something in English. It sounded harsh to the women, yes, but the tone was more confused, maybe even concerned. Not immediately hostile or aggressive.
Meanwhile, the Japanese women, they default immediately to their training.
Absolutely. They form a tight protective circle around Ko. They're whispering, terrified, certain the Americans would shoot her for slowing them down. They were waiting for the promised cruelty, just bracing for the violence that their own military had assured them was inevitable.
But Sachiko, the former teacher, she was the one who instinctively broke that passive waiting. She realized inaction meant Ko's death.
Sachiko understood that the fear of the unknown was worse than the risk of, direct communication. So she stands up and faces the guards. She has no common language, so she uses the most primal form of communication there is. Gestures. She points to Ko, then mimes being unable to walk, holding up her hands in this desperate plea. Please wait, please help. It was a plea of humanity across a profound ideological chasm.
And the soldier's response was not to execute, but to communicate. The red-haired man spoke urgently into a radio handset on his shoulder. They were waiting.
Right. They were actively mobilizing resources. That decision to call for help, rather than just discard the prisoner, that is the first true point of divergence from the propaganda.
So they waited.
They waited under that hot sun while the women tried fruitlessly to ease Ko's agony. Ko was screaming at every touch, and then they heard the sound that changed everything.
The sound of a military jeep.
A jeep speeding toward them, kicking up massive clouds of dust. And when it screeched to a halt, the people who jumped out were not line infantry.
No.
They were medics. They were professionals. They wore the distinct Red Cross armbands, carried medical bags, and they moved with this specific practiced urgency that spoke to training, not combat rage, They weren't looking for prisoners. They were looking for a patient.
And the psychological shift began instantly, with the first act of decency by the young medic.
He knelt beside Ko. He didn't rush or loom. He held up his hands, palms outward, a universal sign of peace and non-aggression. His voice, speaking in English, was described as calm, steady, and gentle, a reassuring tone, despite the chaos.
He tried to communicate his purpose.
He pointed to his medical bag, then to Ko, making it clear his purpose was intervention, not interrogation or punishment.
And then the ultimate act of psychological demolition, the smile.
That smile. It's noted specifically in the records. It wasn't the cruel, mocking smile of a victor, which is what the women had been promised. It was a kind smile. The simple, empathetic expression you give to someone who is in intense pain, a way of communicating, I see you, and I am here to help you.
And Ko's reaction.
Through her tears and paralyzing fear, she saw this expression and was instantly confused. The face of the monster was just a kind young man with a medical bag.
Let's focus on the professional assessment itself. This wasn't basic battlefield triage. This is something else.
This was detailed, modern medical practice in a high-risk environment on a non-combatant enemy civilian. They moved with a high level of technical competency.
So what exactly did the medics do?
First, the standard checks.
Yeah.
Pulse at the wrist and neck, pupil response checked with a small flashlight. This immediately demonstrated their training. They weren't guessing. They were following protocol.
And Ko managed to communicate with them.
Brokenly. In Japanese. She said, my back, my legs, I can't feel them. The medics immediately understood the implication. Potential spinal trauma.
And their internal discussion confirmed the seriousness. They weren't dismissing her pain.
No, not at all. They immediately had this quick, intense, jargon-filled conversation confirming the serious nature of the injury. They were diagnosing a compression or catastrophic nerve injury, likely a spinal fracture, right there in the dust. And that seriousness led immediately to the necessity of pain management before they could even think about moving her.
Which brings us to the syringe. The instant, terrifying fear among the other women who believed it was poison.
That moment is pivotal. It's the ultimate test of trust. The syringe appears and the women gasp. They are ready for the final act of malice.
But Sachiko, the teacher, she recognized it.
She did. Recognizing the general look of the medical apparatus, she managed to communicate to the group that this was medicine-strong pain relief, morphine. And the medic, using calm gestures, communicated, this will help the pain.
And Ko, in absolute agony, she made the choice.
The ultimate choice, trusting the monster over the propaganda. She extended her arm.
And the morphine worked, confirming the trust was warranted.
The change was immediate. The screaming stopped. Her muscles relaxed, her breathing steadied. And the medic didn't just walk away. He stayed with her, monitoring her vitals, speaking softly, maintaining that presence of care. This continuous, dedicated attention to a single injured civilian, an enemy, is what the women observed. It was systematic, competent care.
But the complexity of the evacuation plan is what elevates this from just a moment of mercy to a profound institutional statement.
Here's the thing. This wasn't just a brief moment of aid. This was the mobilization of serious logistical resources for a severely injured enemy prisoner.
A whole other vehicle arrived.
An actual ambulance truck, a larger vehicle, clearly marked with the Red Cross.
Yeah.
And when the medics started the physical evacuation, the women were just stunned by how methodical it was. They did not drag her. They treated her like she was irreplaceable.
The focus was on spinal stabilization. Why is that specific detail so psychologically destructive to the savage narrative?
Because spinal stabilization is high-level trauma management. It requires knowledge, specific training, and specialized equipment. In this case, a spinal board.
Right.
For medics operating in a chaotic, hostile environment like Saipan, immediately after a major battle, to have the discipline and the available logistics to spend minutes carefully rolling an injured enemy prisoner onto her side, supporting her head, and sliding a board underneath her back to ensure the stability of her spine. That is competence overriding every possible motive for hatred or neglect.
That's the highest level of care.
It's the highest level of care. You reserve that for your own critically wounded soldiers.
Wait, let me challenge that for a second. I understand the professionalism, but wouldn't the hatred after months of brutal fighting still create an impulse to just rush, to maybe skip that step for an enemy? Why adhere so strictly to protocol?
Because that's the difference between a disciplined professional military force and the savages the propaganda promised. American medical doctrine, driven by the Geneva Conventions and internal military training, it prioritized the preservation of life once the immediate combat threat was neutralized.
So the medics weren't thinking about politics.
No, they were thinking about procedure. The procedure says, Stabilize the spine or she'll be permanently paralyzed or die. The fact that the resources, the board, the ambulance, the morphine were immediately available on Saipan days after the battle speaks volumes. Savages don't organize logistics to support a strict life-saving protocol for their opponents. They execute. Full stop.
That's a powerful contrast. And the final humanizing touch. The medic makes sure the other 14 women were coming too.
Absolutely. The young medic, climbing into the ambulance beside Ko to continuously monitor her, gestured clearly, "You'll be with your friend." The other women were given transport in a separate truck to follow the ambulance. They were being escorted not to a torture pit, but to a medical facility, with the explicit guarantee of remaining together. The psychological wall was starting to crumble, piece by piece, fueled by professional competence.
As the convoy drove toward the field hospital, the deconstruction continued, moving from the personal active care to this overwhelming institutional display of American scale and resources. They entered a world that, to them, must have felt like science fiction.
It was pure logistics shock. The convoy only drove for maybe 20 minutes, but in that short time they transitioned from the broken, dusty battlefield into a functional, organized American operation. The roads they traveled on suddenly became smoother, graded by engineers. They passed these vast logistical parks, huge metal warehouses, stacks of crates, barrels, and equipment piled higher than any house they had ever seen, trucks moving everywhere, efficiently.
For women who had just experienced the extreme scarcity of a besieged, starving island, that sight must have been fundamentally shattering.
It was staggering. It wasn't just that the Americans had defeated them, it was the manner of the victory. They realized the sheer, overwhelming industrialized power that had been brought against them. This wasn't a resource struggle. It was an organizational and production gap that was insurmountable. The contrast between their own starvation and this abundance hammered home the hopelessness of the military fight.
And the destination, Field Hospital 31st Medical Battalion, it solidified that feeling. Tell us about the environment there.
Organized chaos, but professional. They pulled into a huge compound ringed with tents. The place was teeming with activity. There were wounded American soldiers everywhere, being rushed from ambulances to surgical tents. And the key observation here is that the Japanese women and their escort truck were almost completely ignored.
But not out of malice?
Not at all. It was functional neglect. Everyone was too intensely focused on treating the massive number of casualties that Saipan had generated. The staff was busy saving their own people.
So what the women saw was an operation running at peak efficiency?
Exactly. Dedicated to one goal, saving lives. They saw professional urgency, not ideological vengeance.
They were taken to a small waiting tent, and here they received the first tastes of humanization that were not purely medical, the basics of survival that had become luxuries.
The nurse who met them, a young woman, visibly exhausted, bloodstains on her uniform, but described as having a genuinely kind face, did something simple. She brought them water.
Real, clean water.
In metal canteens. And they drank carefully, suspicious at first, but the thirst was just too profound.
Then came the food. And this is crucial because it speaks to abundance and care, directly contradicting the starvation they'd endured.
The initial offering was canned meat, crackers, chocolate bars, and canned fruit. The women were just staring at sustenance they hadn't seen in maybe a year. During the final battle, they were subsisting on rotten rice mixed with whatever dirt and debris they could find. This is pure, abundant caloric energy.
And Yuki, she was the first to eat, biting into a cracker. What was the reaction?
It was slow, hesitant. Then her eyes widened. It was real food. The sources note that several of the women started crying.
Wow.
They weren't crying from fear anymore. They were crying because of the simple, overwhelming taste of abundance and the shock of having a stomach that was beginning to fill properly. The young nurse watched them, her face conveying genuine, non-hostile sympathy, like, "I'm sorry you were so hungry."
And later, the psychological victory was cemented with the delivery of hot soup.
That hot chicken broth, rich with noodles and vegetables. In a war environment, hot food is a declaration of victory over cold, dirty desperation. It's warm, nourishing comfort. It's the opposite of wartime suffering. For these women, that soup was a profound declaration that they were safe and valued enough to be fed properly and warmly. It's an act of deep human respect, not something you give to animals you intend to torture.
Beyond the food and water, the personal connections cemented the realization. We meet Lieutenant Anderson, an older nurse.
Lieutenant Anderson broke through the anonymity of the enemy prisoner. Despite the overwhelming pressure of American casualties, she took the time. She asked their names, repeating Sachiko's name carefully, making sure she got the pronunciation right.
Treating them like people.
Like people, with individuality. which is exactly the opposite of the dehumanization they experienced under Japanese military command. This is the first time in months, maybe years, they were treated as individuals who mattered, not just cogs in a war machine or prisoners destined for death.
The women were still desperate for news of Ko. How did Anderson navigate that language barrier to deliver the most critical update?
She became a master of compassionate pantomime. Yuki pressed her, frantic for information. Anderson couldn't use English words, so she used universal gestures. She pointed at Ko's spine, made a cutting motion surgery. She showed the compression injury by pressing 2 fingers together.
Right.
Then she gave a hopeful nod and the classic American thumbs up. The surgery was successful. Ko was alive. She had survived a life-threatening, complex injury thanks to the enemy. The psychological weight that lifted from the 14 women at that moment must have been monumental.
They were then moved to the civilian detainee section a few days later, which further demonstrated the systematic nature of this care.
It was an incredible step up. Clean, organized, professional. They had cots with actual mattresses, which for them was luxurious beyond comprehension.
3 regular meals a day.
High-quality meals. Clean clothes. But the detail that our sources focus on, the small human touch that carried massive weight, was the shower. Hot water. And soap that smelled like flowers.
Washing away the literal dirt, blood, and the figurative weight of fear and months of hiding.
They stood under the hot water, washing away the battlefield, washing away the scent of death and the fear. The flowery soap was a symbol of civilization, a symbol of a life they thought they had lost forever. It was sensory proof that their captors operated on a different plane of existence than the monsters they were promised.
And then the ultimate breakthrough realization occurred when Koa was well enough to receive visitors on the 4th day. She delivered the final psychological hammer blow.
Ko was in a clean bed, recovering. Her initial physical report was pure relief. They fixed my back. I can feel them again. I can wiggle my toes. The professional medics had delivered on their promise. They had saved her ability to walk.
But the real shock, the thing that broke the foundation of the propaganda, was her observation of her surroundings.
That's the moment of maximum cognitive dissonance. She looked around the recovery tent and saw she was in a bed right beside wounded American soldiers. The very people who had fought and killed her countrymen, the enemy she was conditioned to despise, were receiving identical care right next to her.
And she said it out loud.
She articulated the core contradiction. They're treating me the same as them, the same medicine, the same food. I don't understand. We're the enemy. Why would they save me?
The equality of suffering and treatment. They were being valued as human beings, no less or more than the American combatants.
Exactly. The propaganda claimed that Japanese lives were worthless to the Americans. The reality was that American institutional values dictated that all critical injuries receive high-level trauma care, regardless of nationality, once they became a patient. This wasn't mercy. This was protocol applied competently. And that systemic professionalism was infinitely more destructive to the propaganda than any single act of kindness could have been.
And that's the turning point for Sachiko, the teacher, who speaks the words that summarize the entire experience.
Sachiko, who was already processing the shock of the abundance and the care, she finally spoke the truth they had all reached collectively. Maybe everything we were told was a lie.
And that's it.
The physical salvation led directly to a psychological and spiritual liberation. They were freed from the physical pain, but the transformation that occurred over the next few weeks was purely psychological.
The women remained at the compound for 3 months. They were given light work, but as the source notes, the real struggle was always in their minds, in their hearts. They were essentially undergoing this forced, real-time re-education, processing the staggering contradiction between deep-seated ideology and consistent, undeniable human decency.
Listen, think about the weight of that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Everything they had been taught about honor, death, and the monstrous nature of the West was being disproven daily by routine, boring competence.
A clean bed, a nurse asking for their name.
The reliable delivery of 3 meals. They couldn't just discard a lifetime of belief overnight, but the facts were overwhelming the narrative. They were forced to reconcile what their leaders demanded, which was suicide, versus what their enemy delivered, which was life-saving surgery.
And the commitment to their care didn't falter, even as fresh combat casualties arrived. The sources point out that Ko continued to recover in a bed adjacent to new American wounded, men injured fighting Japanese forces elsewhere. That operational integrity is stunning.
That's the definition of professional protocol overriding the passions of war. The hospital treated the injury, full stop. They saw a patient, not a political identity. Ko's recovery was remarkable. She eventually walked with a cane, an outcome the American doctors noted was incredible given the severity of her collapse. They not only saved her life, but fundamentally restored her mobility. They had gone above and beyond.
After 3 months, they were classified as civilian detainees, and complex repatriation plans began. Eventually, they left on a neutral Swedish ship destined for Yokohama,
They were going home.
carrying this truth back to a nation that was still being told the lies.
And that truth, for Wacko, became her life's purpose. She kept a detailed diary, recording not just the facts of her capture, but the emotional and psychological journey. Her entries frame the experience as a fundamental, forced re-education delivered by the people who were supposed to be her demons.
The demonstration of power she witnessed, the one she carried, it wasn't about tanks or planes. It was about logistics applied to human care.
Absolutely. The American military had already demonstrated overwhelming physical power. But the deeper lesson was the demonstration of a different kind of power, the power of compassion over cruelty. When you see an enemy with infinite resources choose to apply those resources to save your life equally alongside their own, the psychological impact is total. The hatred required by the state is completely invalidated by the action of the individual medic.
This leads to her ultimate profound realization captured in her diary entry, the breaking of the lie.
The quote is chilling because it speaks to a captivity far deeper than physical prison. She wrote, "They saved my spine, but they broke something else. The lies that had held us captive far more than any prison fence, and in breaking those lies, they freed us to see the truth."
The ultimate act of warfare was not the bullet that injured her, but the compassion that liberated her mind from the control of her government.
That's it.
We have to pause here to discuss the cognitive architecture of this. For decades, their entire cultural foundation rested on the superiority of the Japanese spirit and the inhumanity of the enemy. How do you integrate the fact that the enemy is demonstrably more humane than your own leadership when your entire identity is built on the opposite premise?
It creates a vacuum of belief. Your life has been defined by loyalty to a system that demanded your death. Now, the system you were told to fight to the death is the one that saved your life. You have to rebuild your moral and psychological framework from scratch, based on the reality of the clean sheets, the hot soup, and the successful surgery. It requires immense emotional labor to accept that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the American soldier, but the official narrative.
Keiko ensured this difficult truth was passed down through generations. What was her final clear message to her grandchildren?
Her message was simple, blunt, and drawn directly from her experience on that dusty road. Hatred is taught. Compassion is a choice. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but simple human decency.
She saw it firsthand.
She saw firsthand that the enemy valued her life when her own nation had commanded her death. That is the lesson of the Hidden Front. The true fight was won by a medical team choosing competence and care over vengeance.
It redefines the meaning of defeat. For those 15 women, military defeat led to a personal, psychological victory, the freedom to reject a deadly lie.
Exactly. The collapse of propaganda is often more enduring than the collapse of a battle line. The physical truth of a skilled surgeon and a warm meal is impossible to refute, even decades later.
That is the deep dive into the hidden front of Saipan. We tracked the journey of 15 women from the stench of death and the anticipation of monstrous cruelty to the reality of professional care, abundant food, and life-saving spinal surgery. For them, the truth arrived not in a treaty signing, but on a dusty road in the form of an American medical team who prioritized competence and the preservation of life over the chaos and hatred of war.
And the significance here is for you, the listener, who often studies history through grand strategy. We need to remember that the most decisive victories happen on the unseen, hidden front lines of personal belief.
Right.
The facts of the battlefield, a perfectly administered dose of morphine, a spinal board stabilizing a fracture, a nurse learning a foreign name, they overwhelm the most sophisticated and terrifying propaganda machine ever built. It's a profound lesson in the power of institutional values when applied under pressure.
The military had promised torture and death. The medics delivered a professional standard of care that saved Ko's ability to walk and, in the process, saved the minds of 15 women from ideological captivity.
The lie had no chance against that kind of reality. They were freed to see the truth, often the hardest thing to confront.
And as we close out, consider this final provocative thought based on their journey back home. We know these women were put on a neutral ship and returned to Yokohama. After being told by their own military that their death was valued over their life, and after the American enemy had so carefully and decisively broken those core national lies with undeniable humanity, how difficult must it have been for Koanea and the others to return to a devastated nation that, even in its defeat, still required them to internalize those very same propaganda-fueled narratives of hatred and victimhood. They were liberated, but they returned to a society still trapped.